Fort Wayne, Indiana. Friday, July 15th, 1983. 3:32 in the afternoon. A brass steam whistle, purchased in 1928, loud enough to wake every neighborhood in the city, screams across the summer air. It is the last time it will ever sound. Inside the plant, a green Model 4 200 rolls off the assembly line. Someone has scrawled 2 lines across its cab in black marker. "Sorry, Fort Wayne," and "Last panel, that's all, folks." It is the 1,527,299th truck built here in 60 years. It is also the last. 1,700 workers stand frozen on the floor. A 23-year veteran named Steven Sims stares at the truck and whispers, "It's like losing one of your kids." This was International Harvester, America's 4th largest corporation, the company that taught the Midwest how to farm, the company whose crimson tractors defined the American heartland for over a century. How does a 152-year-old giant die on a Friday afternoon in Indiana? The story begins in a Virginia blacksmith shop. The year is 1831. Walnut Grove, Virginia. The summer of 1831. A 22-year-old blacksmith's son named Cyrus Hall McCormick was bent over a wooden contraption in his father's workshop, trying to finish what his father could not. Robert McCormick had spent years chasing the same dream, a machine that could harvest grain faster than human hands. He had failed. His son was about to succeed. For 10,000 years, wheat had been cut the same way. A man with a scythe could harvest 2 acres in a single day if he worked from sunrise to sundown. It was brutal labor. It set a hard ceiling on how much a single farm could grow, how many mouths a single farmer could feed. Break that ceiling and you could change the shape of a nation. That July, Cyrus McCormick hitched his contraption to a horse and ran it through a field of late wheat near the Virginia mountains. The machine worked. 1 man, 1 horse, 1 afternoon, 10 acres cut. 5 times the output of a scythe. The ceiling had broken. He patented it 3 years later, in 1834. And then, for a long time, almost nothing happened. Cyrus McCormick was a brilliant inventor and a terrible businessman. Virginia farmers were skeptical. The machine was expensive. The Panic of 1837, a financial collapse that would wipe out banks from New York to New Orleans, drove the McCormick family into bankruptcy. For the next 7 years, Cyrus paid down debts with his own 2 hands, working on the farm while his reaper gathered dust. He might have ended his life as an obscure Southern tinkerer. But in the 1840s, something shifted. Out west, in Ohio, in Indiana, in the rolling flatlands of Illinois, a new kind of farm was rising. Bigger fields, flatter country, fewer hands. The reaper that had been a luxury in Virginia was a necessity on the prairie. Cyrus realized his market was not in the east. It was beyond the Appalachians. In 1847, he made a decision that would reshape American industry. He packed his operation and moved it to a small lake port in northern Illinois. The town had fewer than 30,000 residents. Its streets turned to mud every spring. Nobody thought much of it. Its name was Chicago. Over the next 53 years, Chicago would explode into one of the largest cities on Earth. 1.7 million people by 1900, probably the 5th largest city in the world. And Cyrus McCormick would grow with it. He kept improving his reapers. He added binders, harvesters, threshers. But his real genius was not in the machines. It was in how he sold them. McCormick invented modern sales itself. He offered installment plans, pay half now, half after harvest, decades before anyone else. He offered written warranties. He printed testimonials from satisfied farmers and mailed them by the thousands. And most importantly, he built a distribution network unlike anything American industry had ever seen. Over 10,000 dealers, scattered from Pennsylvania to the Dakotas, each one trained to service McCormick machines and stock McCormick parts. By the 1880s, the McCormick plant on Chicago's South Side covered more than 1 million square feet and employed over 5,000 men. It was one of the largest factories in the world. Cyrus McCormick died in 1884, a multi-millionaire. His widow, Nettie, 26 years his junior, took the reins alongside their son, Cyrus Jr. The family name was now stamped onto half the grain harvested between the Mississippi and the Rockies. But across town, on Chicago's North Side, another giant was rising. William Deering had made his fortune in Maine Textiles, in a company that, remarkably, still exists today. In the 1870s, restless and looking for a second act, he invested in a struggling Illinois implement maker. Within a decade, he had moved his family to Chicago and built the Deering Harvester Company into a direct rival of McCormick. His factory employed 7,000 men. His engineers, in some years, out-innovated McCormick's. By the 1890s, the two companies were locked in a brutal price war, and they weren't alone. Dozens of smaller competitors circled them: Milwaukee Harvester, Plano, Champion, each slashing prices, each undercutting dealers, each trying to survive in a market that was drowning in its own success. American farms were producing more grain than the world could buy. American factories were producing more machines than American farms could absorb. The whole industry was heading for a cliff. McCormick's executives saw it. Deering's executives saw it. And both families began to wonder whether the old-fashioned way, fighting each other to the death, was the path to ruin. In the last days of the 19th century, in quiet rooms in Chicago and New York, a handful of men began whispering about something radical, something that would require the blessing of America's most powerful banker, something that would fuse the two greatest rivals in American agriculture into a single, unbreakable empire. The man they would need to make it happen had an office on Wall Street. His name was J.P. Morgan. New York City. The winter of 1902. On the corner of Wall Street and Broad, inside a marble building that served as the unofficial capital of American finance, a 64-year-old man with a bulbous nose and piercing eyes was doing what he did best. He was saving an industry from itself. John Pierpont Morgan had already rescued the American economy once, in 1895, when he personally loaned gold to the U.S. Treasury to keep the federal government solvent. He had consolidated the steel industry into U.S. Steel just 1 year earlier, creating the first billion-dollar corporation in human history. Now, a delegation of Harvester executives had come to him with a problem he recognized instantly. Too many companies, too many factories, too little profit. The American farm implement industry was tearing itself apart. Morgan listened. Then he went to work. The negotiations took months. Cyrus McCormick Jr. and Harold McCormick represented their families' interests on one side. Charles Deering and his brother James Deering represented theirs on the other. Three smaller but profitable firms, Milwaukee Harvester, Plano Manufacturing, and Warder, Bushnell, and Glessner, maker of the popular Champion brand, were brought into the conversation. Each family distrusted the others. Each family was convinced it was being cheated. Morgan's lieutenant, a sharp young financier named George Walbridge Perkins, did most of the actual work. Perkins was a true believer in industrial consolidation. He thought competition itself was wasteful, that the future belonged to giant, integrated corporations run by professional managers. He wore down the resistance one meeting at a time. He found the formulas that let each family save face. He got the deal done. In the summer of 1902, the papers were signed. The International Harvester Company was born. Capitalized at over $100 million, an almost unimaginable sum at the time. It was instantly one of the largest industrial corporations in America. From the moment of its creation, it controlled more than 80% of the American harvester market. It owned factories in Chicago, Milwaukee, Canton, Springfield, and Plano. It employed tens of thousands. It inherited the combined dealer networks of all 5 predecessor firms, more than 10,000 outlets stretching from the Carolinas to the Oregon Territory. It was, on paper, an unstoppable machine. The new board met in Chicago. Cyrus McCormick Jr. became president. Charles Deering became chairman. George Perkins took a seat as the voice of the Morgan interests, watching over everyone. The headquarters rose on Michigan Avenue, a monument in limestone and granite, staring out over Lake Michigan. 2 blocks away, the old McCormick Reaper Works, the original Chicago plant Cyrus Sr. had built in 1847, still thundered day and night, now stamped with the letters IH. For the first few years, the merger worked exactly as Morgan had promised. Prices stabilized, profits climbed. The smaller competitors that had survived the consolidation were gradually swallowed up or pushed out. International Harvester expanded into tractors, into trucks, into cream separators and manure spreaders and twine. By 1910, it was selling in 47 countries. Its Russian subsidiary alone employed more than 2,000 workers. McCormick Deering machines pulled up grain on 6 continents. But beneath the prosperity, something was already wrong. The merger had created a giant, and like many giants, it had trouble moving. Decisions that once took days at the old McCormick Company now required months of committee review. Rivalries between the McCormick faction and the Deering faction simmered for decades. Middle managers learned that caution was safer than ambition. The sprawling collection of factories, each with its own traditions and unions and local loyalties, resisted modernization. The dealer network, once IH's greatest asset, began to calcify, protected by senior salesmen who had grown wealthy and did not want the rules to change. The federal government noticed the size of the new company almost immediately. In 1912, the Department of Justice filed an antitrust suit. The case dragged on for more than a decade. International Harvester was eventually forced to sell off several subsidiaries and open its dealer network to competitors' products. It was a warning shot, and the company's first lesson that bigness alone did not guarantee survival. Still, the Crimson machines kept rolling. Through the Great War, through the Roaring Twenties, through the Great Depression, through the Second World War, International Harvester did what it had been built to do. It fed America. It mechanized the American farm. It employed generations of Midwestern families. It became, in the truest sense, a national institution. For 75 years, it would dominate American agriculture. And for 75 years, the flaws built into it at birth would stay hidden, waiting for a moment, a market, and a man who would expose every one of them at once. That moment was coming. But first, there was a machine to build, a tractor, and it would change everything. Chicago, 1923. In a cramped design studio on the International Harvester campus, a team of engineers had been working on a problem for almost a decade. American farms were getting bigger. American tractors were getting heavier. And somewhere along the way, the machines had stopped fitting the work. The tractors of the early 1920s were brutes, heavy, clumsy, unable to navigate between the rows of growing corn or cotton. A farmer could use them to pull a plow in the spring. After that, they sat useless in the barn, while he hitched up his horses to cultivate. It was a strange, half-finished mechanical revolution, and it left money on the table. IH's engineers wanted a tractor that could plant, cultivate, and harvest. A single machine that could do everything a team of mules could do, and do it all year. They called their prototype the Farmall. It looked almost delicate compared to its competitors. High, narrow, with a tricycle front end that let it slip between crop rows without crushing the plants. When it rolled out of the factory in late 1923, skeptics laughed. By 1924, International Harvester sold 205 of them at $825 each. By 1932, they had built 134,954. The Farmall did not just sell, it converted. It took farmers who had sworn by horses and mules their whole lives and turned them into believers. It showed up in Iowa cornfields, in Texas cotton country, in Kansas wheat fields, in Wisconsin dairy pastures. It came in one color, a deep, unmistakable red, and that red became the color of American agriculture itself. You could drive across the Midwest in the 1930s and see it in every county. Crimson machines moving in slow straight lines across an endless grid of fields. Then came the Farmall H. Introduced in 1939 and produced until 1953, the Farmall H became the best-selling farm tractor in human history. 391,730 units, a single model, a single production run, a record that has never been broken. If you grew up on an American farm in the 1940s or 1950s, there is a better-than-even chance you learned to drive on a Farmall H. If your grandfather farmed in the heartland, there is a near certainty his barn still has one parked in the corner. But the tractor was only the beginning. In 1923, the same year the first Farmall rolled out of Chicago, International Harvester opened a new factory 600 acres wide on the eastern edge of a small Indiana city. The city had offered almost anything to get the plant: affordable housing for workers, new rail spurs, trolley lines, even a city-funded beltway. The company had taken the deal. The name of the city was Fort Wayne. For the next 60 years, Fort Wayne would build International Harvester trucks, medium-duty haulers, heavy-duty semi-tractors, delivery vans, buses. At its peak, the plant would employ 10,500 workers, one of the largest employers in the state of Indiana. And a brass steam whistle, purchased in 1928, would signal its shift changes to every neighborhood within 5 miles. Fort Wayne called itself the heavy-duty truck capital of the world. The claim was earned. By the late 1950s, International Harvester was not just a tractor company. It was an empire. It made the International Lodestar, which became the default medium-duty truck of American commerce. It made the chassis for a generation of American school buses. It made the Scout, a compact, boxy sport utility vehicle introduced in 1960 that predated the Ford Bronco by 5 years and the Jeep Wagoneer by 2, selling more than 500,000 units over its lifetime. It made the Travelall, a full-size family hauler that was, in effect, the first American SUV. It made Cub Cadet riding mowers. It made construction equipment, bulldozers, loaders, backhoes. It made refrigerators. It made freezers. For a brief period, it even made household air conditioners. By 1970, International Harvester employed more than 100,000 people. It operated 42 manufacturing plants in 24 countries. It was America's 4th largest industrial corporation. And in 1950, as a kind of capstone to decades of prosperity, it had signed a master contract with the United Auto Workers. The contract was generous even by the standards of the post-war boom. It had no mandatory overtime. It protected the right of any worker to transfer to any open position in the company based on seniority alone. It was, union negotiators believed at the time, an act of corporate goodwill. They did not yet understand what they had been given. For the next 29 years, that contract would be renewed with only minor changes. For the next 29 years, every major competitor of International Harvester, John Deere, Caterpillar, Ford, Allis-Chalmers, would quietly negotiate tougher labor terms for themselves. By 1979, International Harvester would be paying its workers more and demanding less of them than any other major manufacturer in America. That gap, invisible for decades, would become the hairline crack that brought the whole empire down. But first, the empire would meet a rival, a smaller company, a greener tractor, and a set of management instincts that IH had lost somewhere along the way. Its name was Deere. Moline, Illinois, the early 1970s. About 150 miles west of Chicago, on a stretch of the Mississippi River where the water bends sharply south, a competitor that International Harvester had been beating for over a century was quietly learning how to win. John Deere and Company had been founded in 1837, just 3 years after Cyrus McCormick patented his reaper. For most of the next 130 years, Deere had been the smaller company. In the mid-1950s, IH had outsold Deere in tractors by a wide margin. Deere made good machines, but it was a regional brand, a steady number two, a well-run family firm that nobody in Chicago took seriously as a long-term threat. Then, sometime in the 1960s, something changed. Deere decided to become the best tractor company in the world. Not the biggest, the best. It poured money into research. It redesigned its machines from the ground up. It trained its dealers obsessively. It narrowed its focus almost to the point of stubbornness. Deere would build farm equipment, and nothing else would distract it. Meanwhile, in Chicago, International Harvester was trying to build everything: tractors, trucks, construction equipment, school buses, refrigerators, lawnmowers, a sport utility vehicle. For a while, it had even made its own steel at a plant called Wisconsin Steel on the south side of Chicago, a relic of the old McCormick empire that was hemorrhaging money by the year. Every one of IH's major lines competed with a rival that did only that one thing and did it better. Caterpillar made better bulldozers. Mack made better trucks. Ford made a better SUV. And in Moline, Deere was making better tractors. The numbers told the story in slow motion. In 1970, International Harvester was still the largest farm equipment manufacturer in North America. By 1972, Deere had pulled even. By 1974, Deere had pulled ahead. By 1977, Deere had nearly doubled IH's market share in the high-horsepower tractor segment, the segment where the profit was. IH's profit margins were roughly half of Deere's, half of Caterpillar's. In some quarters, less than that. The company was not losing money. It was still, by most measures, healthy. It still posted billions of dollars in annual revenue, but its growth had stalled, and the men on the board of directors knew that stall was the beginning of the dive. The man they looked to for answers was Brooks McCormick. He was the great-grandnephew of Cyrus. He had grown up inside the company the way a prince grows up inside a palace. He was 63 years old, thoughtful, restrained, a careful steward of a name that had meant something in American industry for 5 generations. He had become CEO in 1971. He had done what he could. He had sold off Wisconsin Steel. He had ended production of light-duty trucks. He had cut payroll at headquarters. He had pushed for modernization and been met, everywhere he turned, with committees and delays and the polite resistance of men who had worked at IH for 40 years and had no intention of changing the way things were done. Brooks McCormick understood something his directors did not yet want to admit. The problem at International Harvester was not strategic. It was cultural. The company had grown old. It had grown cautious. It had grown slow. And a McCormick could not fix what generations of McCormicks had allowed to calcify. He needed an outsider. In 1977, the board hired the consulting firm Booz Allen Hamilton to conduct a full review of the company. The consultants returned with a verdict that confirmed Brooks's worst instincts. International Harvester, they said, needed a high-powered executive from the outside, someone unbound by tradition, someone who could cut what needed to be cut, someone who could drag a 100,000-employee company into the modern era. The board agreed. Brooks McCormick began making phone calls. He called contacts at General Electric. He called men at Ford. He called executives at General Motors. He interviewed candidates for months. And eventually his search narrowed on a single name, a name that had been in the newspapers lately, a name tied to one of the most prestigious companies in America. The man was president of Xerox Corporation. His resume was the kind that boards dream of. MBA from Michigan. Ford Finance. A rising star at Xerox during the years when Xerox could do no wrong. The years when its copier machines were printing money and its Palo Alto Research Center was inventing the future of computing. He was 50 years old, polished, articulate. He had a reputation as a disciplined cost cutter and a hard negotiator. And he was, reportedly, unhappy at Xerox. Brooks McCormick spent months courting him. Lunches in Connecticut, dinners in Chicago, private meetings in New York. The two men talked about vision, about strategy, about what International Harvester could become under the right leadership. And slowly, carefully, the Xerox executive allowed himself to be persuaded. He would accept the offer. But the price would be extraordinary. The price would be the largest executive compensation package in the history of the American Midwest. His name was Archie McCardle. Rochester, New York. The spring of 1977. Inside the executive offices of Xerox Corporation, a 50-year-old man named Archie R. McCardle was finishing one career and preparing to begin another. On his desk sat an offer from International Harvester that would change his life. In ways nobody yet understood, changed the lives of 100,000 people he had never met. Archie McCardle did not look like a man who would one day be called the worst CEO in American history. He was quiet, almost unassuming, slim build, receding hairline, the kind of face you would forget at a cocktail party. He had been born in Hazel Park, Michigan, in August of 1926, the first person in his family ever to attend college. He had served in the United States Army Air Forces in the last years of the Second World War. He had earned his bachelor's degree and his MBA at the University of Michigan. He had joined Ford Motor Company in 1949 as a financial analyst, climbed steadily, and by the early 1960s was running Ford's Australian operations as secretary-treasurer. In 1966, he had jumped to Xerox. Xerox, in the late 1960s, was one of the great corporate success stories of the 20th century. Its 914 copier had become the single most profitable industrial product in history. Its stock was a darling of Wall Street. Its research arm, the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, had been founded in 1970 and was, at that very moment, inventing almost every element of modern computing: the graphical user interface, the computer mouse, the personal workstation, the laser printer, Ethernet networking. Years later, Steve Jobs would walk through Xerox PARC and famously lift its ideas to build the Macintosh. Bill Gates would borrow from the same well to build Windows. But Xerox itself would commercialize almost none of it. By 1971, Archie McCardle had become president of Xerox. For 3 years, the company posted record profits. Then Japanese competitors, Canon, Ricoh, Minolta, began flooding the American market with cheaper copiers. Xerox was slow to respond. Its margins narrowed, its dominance cracked. And somewhere in those same years, the decision was made, at the executive level, not to seriously commercialize the revolutionary work being done at PARC. The personal computer revolution would happen, but it would happen in Cupertino and Redmond, not in Rochester. Archie McArdle watched it slip away. And as the 1970s wore on, he began to look for a bigger stage. International Harvester, when Brooks McCormick called, was an almost irresistible target. It was massive, the fourth largest industrial corporation in America, more than 100,000 employees worldwide, factories on 4 continents. It was struggling, which meant there was room for a turnaround, for the kind of dramatic reinvention that made executive careers. And it was old, which meant that whoever came in with the mandate to change things would have enormous latitude. The negotiations stretched through the spring and summer of 1977. McArdle wanted assurance. He wanted authority. And he wanted a compensation package that would tell Wall Street that International Harvester meant business. Brooks McCormick delivered, on every front. On August 3, 1977, Archie McArdle was announced as the new president and chief operating officer of International Harvester. In January 1978, he was elevated to chief executive officer, and the numbers attached to his arrival made headlines from Chicago to Manhattan. An annual salary of $460,000, one of the highest executive salaries in the United States. A signing bonus of $1.5 million, cash, upfront, and a loan, $1.8 million, at 6% interest, far below market rate. The money was to be used to buy International Harvester stock. And, in a clause that would eventually bring the company to court, the loan would be entirely forgiven if McArdle managed to push IH's financial performance above the average of its 6 main competitors. In total, if he hit his targets, Archie McArdle would be compensated roughly $3.8 million in his first year alone. In 1977 dollars. In a Midwestern industrial company whose assembly line workers were making, on average, less than $20,000 a year. It was, at the time, one of the most extravagant executive compensation packages ever offered in American history. McArdle arrived in Chicago in the late summer of 1977 and moved fast. Within months, he had launched a sweeping cost-cutting program that slashed $640 million out of the company's operating budget. He announced an $879 million plan to modernize IH's aging plants over 3 years. He fired hundreds of middle managers. He consolidated divisions. He brought in his own team of Ford and Xerox veterans. And for a moment, it looked as though Brooks McCormick had made the right call. In fiscal year 1979, International Harvester posted record sales of $8.4 billion. It posted record profits of $370 million, nearly double the previous year. Wall Street cheered. The business press cheered. Archie McArdle was celebrated as the decisive outsider who had shaken a sleeping giant awake. But underneath the numbers, the real picture was grimmer. IH's profit margins, even after all the cuts, were still only half of Caterpillar's, still only half of Deere's. McArdle knew it. He needed one more breakthrough, one more big move to close the gap. He decided the gap lived inside the union contract. He was about to pick a fight with 35,000 men. Chicago, the fall of 1979. Archie McArdle had been studying the numbers for months, and the numbers made him angry. International Harvester's labor contracts were, by any objective measure, the most generous in the American heavy equipment industry. The 1950 master contract with the United Auto Workers had established 2 provisions that no other major manufacturer lived with. First, there was no mandatory overtime. A worker could refuse weekend shifts, holiday shifts, any shift beyond his regular schedule, and the company could do nothing about it. Second, any worker could transfer to any open position anywhere in the company, provided he was the most senior applicant. Not the most qualified, the most senior. At Caterpillar, management could order overtime. At Deere, management could assign workers where they were needed. At IH, management asked permission. McArdle believed these provisions alone had cost International Harvester $1.3 billion over 3 years in lost efficiency, excess staffing, and production delays. He wanted them gone, not trimmed, gone. In the spring of 1979, as IH's contract with the UAW neared expiration, McArdle drafted a list of 7 demands: mandatory overtime, restrictions on job transfers, changes to pieceworker pay, new rules on seniority. He presented them not as suggestions, but as requirements, the minimum the company would accept to sign a new agreement. The UAW's negotiators read the list and understood exactly what it meant. These were not ordinary contract proposals. This was an attempt to dismantle 3 decades of labor protections in a single stroke. Every demand touched a provision the union considered sacred. Mandatory overtime had been fought over in 1958, and the union had won. Job transfers had been fought over in 1958, and the union had won. The UAW had no intention of surrendering in 1979 what it had bled for in 1958. McArdle, for his part, was not bluffing. He believed a short strike would bring the union to its senses. He had studied the 1958 walkout, 9 weeks, a nuisance, quickly settled, and concluded that the UAW could not sustain a long fight. He told his board that the strike, if it came, would last no more than a few weeks. He told industry analysts the same thing. He was wrong by about 5 months. On November 1st, 1979, at 12 noon, 35,000 members of the United Auto Workers, 36% of International Harvester's total workforce, walked off the floor at 21 plants in 8 states: Georgia, Illinois, Indiana, Kansas, Kentucky, Minnesota, Ohio, Tennessee, Texas. The picket signs went up before the lunch hour was over. In Chicago, Archie McArdle watched the walkout from the executive suite and did not flinch. He saw opportunity. He told colleagues that the strike was a chance to challenge the union's grip on the workplace, to force concessions that decades of IH leadership had been too timid to demand. For nearly a month, he refused to negotiate. The 2 sides met briefly on November 26th for roughly 1 hour. No progress was made. McArdle held firm. The union held firmer. On December 13th, bargaining reopened, just as the UAW settled a separate strike at Caterpillar, freeing up its full attention and its war chest for the fight against International Harvester. The timing could not have been worse for McArdle. And then something happened that no amount of financial modeling could have predicted. The world changed around him. In late December 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. On January 4, 1980, President Jimmy Carter imposed a grain embargo against the Soviets, the largest buyer of American wheat. Overnight, the floor fell out from under the American farm economy. Farmers who had been planning to buy new equipment canceled their orders. Dealers who had been stocking IH inventory sent it back. The agricultural market, which had been IH's foundation for 150 years, was collapsing in real time. At the same moment, the Federal Reserve, under Paul Volcker, was ratcheting interest rates to historic levels to fight inflation. By early 1980, the prime rate would reach 20%. Farmers could not borrow. Consumers could not spend. The American economy was tipping into the worst recession since the 1930s. International Harvester was now fighting a war on 2 fronts: a union strike that showed no sign of ending, and a macroeconomic catastrophe that no CEO could have controlled. McArdle's board had expected a 3-week walkout. They were now staring at week 8, week 10, week 12. The company was losing money at a rate that stunned even its own accountants. On January 10, 1980, IH disclosed that losses in the first quarter could reach $225 million, 10% of its total shareholders' equity. if the strike continued. The top 25 officers took 20% salary cuts. Travel was frozen. Advertising was slashed. Capital spending was cut by $100 million. The budget for the company's annual shareholder meeting was quietly scaled back. None of it was enough. And in the newsroom of the Fort Wayne Journal-Gazette, a reporter had just gotten hold of an internal IH memorandum, written months before the strike began. That would change everything. Fort Wayne, Indiana, mid-December 1979. The memo had been written in January of that year, 10 months before the strike began, inside International Harvester's corporate planning offices in Chicago. It was never meant to be seen by anyone outside the company. But someone had leaked it, and now it was sitting on the desk of a reporter at the Fort Wayne Journal-Gazette. The contents were devastating. The memo laid out a plan to build a new IH manufacturing plant in Wagoner, Oklahoma, a right-to-work state where unions had almost no legal leverage. The purpose of the Wagoner plant, according to the memo, was to gradually absorb production capacity from the Fort Wayne truck complex. Over time, as output shifted to Oklahoma, the Fort Wayne plant would shrink. Its workforce would dwindle. Its union locals, among the largest and most powerful in the UAW, would lose their leverage and eventually their reason to exist. The memo did not call this union busting, but it did not need to. The plan was clear: dismantle Fort Wayne one production line at a time and build a non-union replacement in a state where the workers had no collective bargaining power. When the Journal-Gazette published its report, the reaction inside the UAW was volcanic. Union leaders had spent 6 weeks on the picket line believing they were fighting over overtime rules and seniority provisions. Now they understood they were fighting for survival. The company, in their eyes, had never intended to negotiate in good faith. It had been planning to destroy them before the first picket sign was painted. Whatever slim chance remained for a quick settlement died with that memo. The two sides hardened. IH went public with its bargaining positions, a tactic that most labor relations experts considered reckless because it left no room for the quiet compromises that end strikes. The union dug in deeper. No talks were scheduled for most of January 1980. On January 30th, the UAW raised strike benefits across the board: $55 a week for single workers, $65 for married workers with dependents. It was a signal. The union was telling International Harvester that it could outlast whatever pain the company was willing to inflict. February came. Negotiations reopened on the 4th, lasted a single day, and collapsed. McCardle offered a modified overtime proposal: mandatory overtime only when not enough regular workers volunteered. The union rejected it without explanation and walked out. The strike was now past the 117-day mark. It had become the longest walkout in UAW history, surpassing the old record set against another company years before. Industry analysts began to panic. IH's inventories were running dry. Dealers across the Midwest had nothing to sell. Farmers who needed new equipment for the spring planting season were walking into John Deere dealerships instead. Every day the strike continued, International Harvester hemorrhaged roughly $2.8 million, enough to pay the annual salary of 140 assembly line workers. Gone. Every single day. By March, the financial bleeding had become impossible to hide. IH disclosed that losses for the first half of the fiscal year had reached $479.4 million. Its short-term debt, which had stood at $442 million before the strike, had swollen past $1 billion. The company was borrowing to survive. On March 18th, negotiators reached a tentative agreement on the mandatory overtime issue. A voluntary overtime pool, not the compulsory system McCardle had demanded. It was a compromise, but it was movement. 42 of IH's local unions settled their local contracts over the following weeks, but 6 large locals, including Fort Wayne, East Moline, Rock Island, Springfield, and Louisville, held out over the job transfer issue and other unresolved demands. The UAW's leadership made a calculated decision. National talks were suspended so that negotiators could focus on the 6 holdout locals, which both sides recognized as the key to ending the strike. One by one, the locals settled. The last one, in Rock Island, Illinois, signed on April 14th. National talks resumed the next morning. 2 days later, on April 16th, 1980, International Harvester and the United Auto Workers reached a tentative agreement on the National Master Contract. The UAW ratified it on April 19th by a vote of 15,494 to 3,877. On April 20th, the picket signs came down. The strike had lasted 172 days. When the terms were made public, nearly every independent observer reached the same conclusion. The union had kept virtually everything McArdle had tried to take. Mandatory overtime remained voluntary. Seniority-based job transfers remained intact. The piece worker provisions were barely touched. After 6 months of lost production, lost market share, lost dealer confidence, and lost revenue, International Harvester had gained almost nothing. One Wall Street analyst put it plainly. The company, he said, was the undeniable loser. The damage was not abstract. It was specific, and it was permanent. During the 172 days, John Deere had captured IH customers who would never come back. Caterpillar had taken construction contracts that would never be returned. IH's dealer network, the 10,000 outlet empire that Cyrus McCormick had built over a century, had been starved of inventory for half a year, and some dealers had quietly begun stocking competitors' machines just to stay alive. And the losses did not stop when the strike ended. In the following fiscal year, International Harvester lost another $397.3 million. The combined toll, strike plus aftermath, approached $900 million. Archie McArdle had bet the company on a confrontation with its own workforce. He had lost the bet, and the bill was still coming due. Because somewhere inside the company's books, there was a $1.8 million loan with his name on it, and the board had just decided to make it disappear. Chicago, August 1980. The picket signs had been down for 4 months. The factories had reopened. The workers had returned to their stations. And inside International Harvester's executive offices on Michigan Avenue, someone quietly signed a piece of paper that would set the country on fire. The paper forgave Archie McArdle's $1.8 million loan. The terms had been written into his contract 3 years earlier. If McArdle pushed International Harvester's financial performance above the average of its 6 main competitors, the loan would convert from debt to gift. The board reviewed the numbers. In fiscal year 1979, the year before the strike, IH had posted record profits. The benchmarks, technically, had been met. The loan was erased. There was just one problem. Between the moment those benchmarks were hit and the moment the loan was forgiven, International Harvester had lost $479 million. It had borrowed over $1 billion to keep the lights on. It had watched its market share collapse. 35,000 of its workers had spent 6 months on the picket line, earning $55 a week. And the man who had provoked the strike that caused all of it had just received a tax-free gift worth nearly $2 million. When the news reached the press, the reaction was immediate and brutal. Newspapers from Chicago to New York ran the story above the fold. Editorial boards called it obscene. Union leaders called it proof of everything they had always believed about corporate management. Shareholders filed a lawsuit. The company fought to have the suit dismissed. It lost. McArdle, for his part, seemed not to understand the fury. He had met the contractual terms. The board had approved the forgiveness. The process, in his view, had been clean. That tens of thousands of his employees were struggling to recover from a strike he had started. That was a separate matter. But the forgiven loan was only the beginning of his troubles. Fiscal year 1981 brought another $397 million in losses. The strike was over, but the damage it had left behind was compounding. Dealers who had stocked John Deere machines during the walkout were not switching back. Farmers who had bought green tractors in the spring of 1980 were not returning to red. The market itself was contracting. Carter's grain embargo had crushed farm exports. Volcker's interest rates had crushed farm borrowing, and the American heartland was sliding into what economists would later call the farm crisis. Across Iowa, Kansas, and Nebraska, families that had farmed the same land for generations were being forced to auction their equipment, sell their acreage, and walk away. Some of them did not walk away. Some of them, in the darkest chapter of the farm crisis, took their own lives. International Harvester was bleeding into a dying market. In January 1982, McArdle went back to the union. He asked for concessions, $200 million in wage cuts, benefit reductions, and pension savings over 3 years. The UAW's leadership looked at the request, looked at the company's books, and was prepared to negotiate. Then they discovered that McArdle had just authorized $6 million in bonuses for the company's salaried employees. The union walked away from the table. It took 2 more months of worsening losses before the UAW returned. By March 1982, the company's financial condition had deteriorated so badly that even the union's hardliners recognized the danger. If IH collapsed entirely, every union job would vanish. Negotiators reopened talks. They worked through the spring. On May 2, 1982, the UAW ratified a concessionary contract, $200 million in savings for International Harvester, the first time in memory the union had agreed to give back what it had won at the bargaining table. McArdle had finally gotten what he wanted. He had exactly 24 hours to enjoy it. On May 3, 1982, one day after the UAW ratified the concessions, the International Harvester Board of Directors convened a 2-hour emergency meeting. The company's creditor banks had run out of patience. They wanted McArdle gone. The board, after 2 hours of deliberation, agreed. Archie McArdle was fired. He told the press he had resigned. Nobody believed him. Time magazine ran the story under a headline noting that the real wonder was not that he had been fired, but that it had not happened much sooner. When the accountants finished tallying the books for the 3 fiscal years of McArdle's reign, 1980, 1981, and 1982, the number was staggering. International Harvester had lost a combined $2.4 billion. At the time, it was the largest 3-year loss in the history of American business. McArdle was replaced as chairman by Louis W. Menck. Donald D. Lennox took over as president. Both men inherited a company that was, by every meaningful measure, dying. Its debt had ballooned past $4 billion. Its market share in farm equipment had been halved. Its dealer network was fractured. Its workforce was demoralized. Its creditors, 225 banks around the world, were circling. The new leadership had no illusions. The question was no longer whether International Harvester could be saved. The question was which pieces could be sold before the whole thing went under. And in Fort Wayne, Indiana, where a 60-year-old truck plant still employed thousands of workers, where a brass whistle still sounded the shift changes, where families still set their alarm clocks by the rhythm of the factory, a phone call was coming. Chicago, the summer of 1982. The new men in charge of International Harvester had inherited a corpse that was still breathing. $4 billion in debt. 225 creditor banks spread across the globe. 3 divisions, farm equipment, trucks, construction, all losing money simultaneously. And a workforce that had been through a catastrophic strike, a round of concessions, and the firing of a CEO, all in the span of 2 years. Donald Lennox, the new president, understood that survival meant surgery, not reform, not restructuring, amputation. The first limb to go was construction equipment. In 1982, IH sold its entire construction division, bulldozers, wheel loaders, backhoes, everything it had built over decades, to Dresser Industries. The sale raised cash, but it also sent a signal to every employee, every dealer, and every creditor watching from the sidelines. International Harvester was not rebuilding. It was shrinking. Then came the phone call to Fort Wayne. In July 1982, Lennox announced the most sweeping round of cuts yet. 3 truck assembly plants would be consolidated into 2. The plant in Chatham, Ontario, was considered safe. It served the Canadian market and had strong local support. The battle was between the 2 American plants, Fort Wayne, Indiana, and Springfield, Ohio. Fort Wayne had history. Its plant had been running since 1923. It had built more than 1.5 million trucks. It had been the largest employer in the city for 6 decades. Its workforce, even after years of layoffs, still numbered in the thousands. The city mobilized immediately. Business leaders, politicians, union officials, everyone understood what losing the plant would mean. Within weeks, Fort Wayne assembled an aid package worth $31 million. Tax incentives, infrastructure commitments, everything short of a blank check. Springfield fought back. Its plant was newer, only 17 years old. Its equipment was more modern. And the state of Ohio played hardball. Ohio raised its guarantee on a $20 million bank loan from 50% to 85%. It added another $10 million from state liquor profits. In total, the state was underwriting 90% of a $30 million package, meaning Ohio's taxpayers were shouldering nearly all the risk. Fort Wayne had offered more money. Springfield had offered less risk. On September 28, 1982, the announcement landed on the front page of the Fort Wayne Journal-Gazette. International Harvester had chosen Springfield. The Fort Wayne plant would close. 2,200 workers would lose their jobs. Another 1,900 employed in parts distribution and engineering would stay, for now. The closing was not immediate. It was a slow execution. Production would be phased out over 10 months, line by line, shift by shift. Workers who had spent their entire adult lives inside that plant would come to work every morning knowing the end was coming, knowing the machines around them were being crated up and shipped to Ohio, knowing that every truck they built brought them one day closer to the last. While Fort Wayne counted down its final months, the rest of International Harvester continued to disintegrate. Losses for 1982 were projected at $1.6 billion. The company restructured more than $4 billion in debt held by its 225 lenders. A financial negotiation so complex it required teams of lawyers on 3 continents. Dividends to common shareholders, which had been paid without interruption for generations, were eliminated. The board voted to kill them. Stockholders who had held IH shares as a bedrock retirement investment watched their income vanish overnight. By the fall of 1984, every option had been exhausted. The banks had no more patience. The balance sheet had no more room. International Harvester's management began quietly looking for a buyer, not for the whole company, which was beyond saving, but for the one division that still carried the weight of the name. The Farm Equipment Division, the Reaper, The Farmall, the Crimson Machines, the Crown Jewels. Only one buyer stepped forward. Tenneco, Incorporated, a Houston-based conglomerate, owned a struggling farm equipment maker of its own, J.I. Case. Case had a decent product line, but a weak dealer network. I.H. had a legendary dealer network, but was drowning in debt. The logic of the deal was obvious to everyone in the room. On November 23, 1984, the terms were finalized. International Harvester would sell its entire agricultural equipment division to Tenneco. The deal closed in February 1985, after the Department of Justice gave its approval on January 31st. 153 years after Cyrus McCormick patented his reaper in a Virginia workshop, the McCormick name left the American farming business. The new entity was called Case YH. It combined Case's engineering with IH's dealer network, a network that one Tenneco executive would later describe as the greatest off-balance sheet asset the company had ever acquired. The dealer's loyalty to the Red brand, he said, was astonishing. What remained of International Harvester after the sale was a truck and engine manufacturer, profitable in theory, hollowed out in practice. In 1986, the company changed its name. It would no longer be called International Harvester. After 84 years, the name was retired. The new name was Navistar International Corporation. The renaming was quiet. No ceremony, no press conference, just a legal filing in the state of Delaware and a new sign on the door of a Chicago office building that had once housed an empire. But there was still one day that had not yet been told. One afternoon, one whistle, one last truck rolling off a line in Indiana. July 15th, 1983. Before dawn, Fort Wayne, Indiana. Friday, July 15th, 1983. The day began the way 10,000 days before it had begun. In the dark. At 3:30 in the morning, men on the overnight shift were still working under the fluorescent lights of the East Side complex, building trucks they knew no one would follow. The plant stretched across 600 acres along South Pontiac Street and Coliseum Boulevard South, a sprawl of brick and steel and corrugated roofing that had been the economic heartbeat of this city since Warren Harding was president. For 60 years, the rhythm of Fort Wayne had been set not by church bells or city clocks, but by the blast of a steam whistle mounted on the roof of the plant's powerhouse, the Crosby whistle, purchased in 1928 from a marine supply company, originally designed to guide ships through fog. Repurposed here to guide shifts through the day. Every morning, every afternoon, every evening, 3 blasts, and the city moved. This morning, the whistle sounded on schedule, but everyone within earshot knew the schedule was almost over. Jerry Girardeau was 42 years old. He had started at the plant straight out of high school. 24 years. He had punched in every working day of his adult life at the same gate, walked the same corridor, clocked into the same time station. He had watched his children grow up on a paycheck stamped with the letters IH. He had buried his father, knowing that the same company would carry his own family through to retirement. Now he was putting on his boots for the last time. The night before, lying in bed, he had tried to find the words for what this day would feel like. The best he could manage was simple and devastating. It was, he said, a difficult thing to walk away after 25 years and know you were never going to work in that place again. The last truck. By mid-morning, the plant floor had filled with workers who were not scheduled to work. Men from earlier shifts had come back. Retirees had driven in from across the county. Foremen who had already cleared out their lockers stood in the aisles, watching. Nobody had told them to come. Nobody needed to. The assembly line was still running. The last batch of trucks was moving through the stations. Medium-duty haulers and semi-tractors, painted and stamped and fitted with the same components that had rolled through this building since Calvin Coolidge was in the White House. The pace was slower than usual. Workers lingered at each station. Hands that had tightened 10 million bolts moved carefully now, deliberately, as if each one mattered more than the last. Sometime in the early afternoon, the final truck reached the end of the line. It was a green Model 4 200, a cab-over semi-tractor, nothing special to look at, indistinguishable from the thousands that had come before it. But someone had taken a black marker and written 2 messages on the cab panels, in large block letters. The first read, "Sorry, Fort Wayne." The second, "Last panel, that's all, folks." It rolled off the line and stopped. Truck number 1,527,299. The men on the floor gathered around it. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Albert Watson Jr., a veteran of the line, stared at the truck and shook his head. He had always believed, he told a reporter, that this thing would never have an ending to it. He had been wrong. At 3:32 in the afternoon, the final whistle blew. 1,700 workers turned toward the exits. 500 more would come back the following week to crate the machinery and clear the inventory. After that, the doors would close. After that, the 600-acre complex would fall silent for the first time since December 1923. What they said. They came out through the main gate on South Pontiac Street, the same gate most of them had entered on their first day, years or decades ago. Some carried lunch boxes. Some carried tools they had bought with their own money and were now taking home for good. Some carried nothing at all. A UPI reporter stood near the gate, writing down what they said. Stephen Sims, 23 years on the job, stopped beside the last truck before walking out. He looked at it the way a man looks at a child leaving home. After 23 years, he said, it was like losing one of your kids. Jerry D., a plant inspector, said he would miss the people. That was the sadness of this day. Missing the people you had worked with for 22 years. A man named Bill R. Rome, a truck repairman, stood at a window on the upper floor and looked out over the parking lot as it emptied. He did not speak to reporters. The photographs from that afternoon show him standing alone, hands at his sides, watching. Inside the plant, someone had hung a wall calendar near one of the main corridors. Every day of July had been crossed off in red ink, one by one, counting down. The 15th was circled. Below it, in handwriting, someone had written a single word. The word was not recorded by the press, but the calendar itself was photographed, and the image ran in the next morning's edition of the Journal-Gazette under a headline that needed only 3 words. Harvester plant closes. Company spokesman William Greenhill told reporters there were no chins on the chest. The workers, every one of them, knew otherwise. The ripples. The shockwave that rolled out of South Pontiac Street that Friday afternoon did not stop at the plant gates. Fort Wayne's unemployment rate, already battered by years of layoffs, climbed past 12%. Across the city, more than 30,000 jobs had disappeared in the span of 3 years. The school district that depended on International Harvester's property tax payments laid off dozens of teachers and administrators. The Allen County United Way, which had relied on payroll deductions from Harvester workers for decades, slashed its 1983 fundraising target. Social service agencies braced for what they called a rising tide. More families seeking help, more bills going unpaid, more lives unraveling. Mayor Winfield Moses stood in front of the cameras and said what everyone already knew. Experience showed that when unemployment rose, the darkest parts of human nature rose with it. Alcoholism, crime, domestic violence, child abuse. These were not abstract statistics. They were the families of the men who had walked out of that gate at 3:32. But Fort Wayne did not collapse. The $31 million the city had raised in its failed bid to save the Harvester plant was redirected into a new economic development fund. Tax incentives were offered. Infrastructure was upgraded. Loans at 5 and 6% over 20 years were dangled in front of any manufacturer willing to take a chance on a city the national press had already written off. In August 1984, 13 months after the last truck rolled off the line, General Motors announced it would build a new pickup plant on the east side of Fort Wayne. 3,000 jobs. It was not enough to replace what had been lost, but it was enough to stop the bleeding. The GM plant opened in 1987, just as America's appetite for pickup trucks exploded. Fort Wayne survived. 3 endings. Archie McCardle left Chicago and moved to Fairfield, Connecticut, where he purchased the original Pepperidge Farm, the 320-acre estate once owned by Margaret Rudkin, the woman who had founded the baking company in her kitchen during the Great Depression. McCardle subdivided the property and developed it into an affluent residential community. He called it The Ridge. 6 months after leaving International Harvester, he spoke to a group at Harvard Business School. A student asked him to grade his own performance. McCardle did not hesitate. He said he rated himself superb. 4 years later, in a separate interview, he reflected on his compensation. He said he believed, in retrospect, that he had been underpaid. Archie McCardle died on July 10, 2008, in Casper, Wyoming. He was 81 years old. Brooks McCormick, the man who had hired McCardle, watched the company his great-granduncle had founded in 1831 disappear in pieces. The construction division went first, then the trucks, then the farm equipment, the reapers, the farmalls, the combines, the machines that had carried the McCormick name across 6 continents for over a century. When Case IH was formed in 1985, no McCormick sat on its board. The family's 154-year connection to American agriculture was over. Jerry Gerardo and the thousands of workers like him scattered. Some found jobs at the new GM plant. Some moved to Springfield, chasing the production lines that had left Fort Wayne behind. Some never worked in manufacturing again. Their children grew up in a different Fort Wayne, a city that had learned, the hard way, that no factory lasts forever. Silence. In 1984, International Harvester donated the Crosby steam whistle to the Allen County Fort Wayne Historical Society. It was displayed intermittently for nearly 2 decades. In 2012, it was placed in the History Center's Innovation and Technology Gallery, where it remains today, polished brass, silent. The blacksmith shop in Walnut Grove, Virginia, where Cyrus McCormick built his first reaper in 1831, is now a museum. The factory on South Pontiac Street, where 1,527,299 trucks were built over 60 years, stands mostly empty, and the whistle does not sound. But if you drive through Allen County on a summer afternoon, past the old plant, past Harvester Park, past the houses where 10,000 families once lived on IH paychecks, you can still feel something in the air. Not a sound, exactly. More like the memory of a sound. The echo of a city that once set its clocks by a factory, and the factory that once set its rhythm by a whistle, and the whistle that one Friday afternoon in July fell silent and never spoke again.